Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents, a new offering on Village TV. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization committed to peace, social justice, economic equality, and a clean environment. For the duration of the lockdown, instead of its usual 2 meetings a month, Concerned Citizens will broadcast 2 programs a month on this channel. Our programs will feature films, lectures, and debates on topics related to our mission. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. My name is Sue Modell, and I'm chair of the Concerned Citizens Program Committee, which is the group responsible for developing this series of broadcasts. A few times every year, Concerned Citizens has offered book reviews, always in person until now. Book reviews are events at which a knowledgeable member of our organization discusses an important, recently published book. Well before the pandemic, Laguna Woods resident Jan Elbaum offered to discuss She Said by Jodie Cantor and Megan Tuhey. This 2019 page-turner tells the story behind the story. It is the description of how 2 dedicated New York Times reporters got the dirt on Harvey Weinstein and made it stick. Along with Ronan Farrow, who ran a parallel journalistic investigation of Weinstein, Tuhey and Cantor were awarded a full Pulitzer Prize for the articles they published the year before this book appeared. Given the importance of these revelations for the women's movement, Concerned Citizens originally planned to feature this book review in March, which is Women's History Month. But just before the event was scheduled to take place, the pandemic forced Californians to shut down. We are therefore very grateful that today, July 14th, 2020, Jan has agreed to give her presentation remotely. When it is finished, she will take a few questions from the audience. Jan Elbaum came to California in 1943. She has held a variety of jobs, most often as a teacher. The subjects she most likes to teach are stained glass art and comparative religion. But she's taught every subject she's ever been asked to teach, and there were plenty of them. Arriving in Laguna Woods in 1986, Jan has participated in many of the crafts housed in Clubhouse 4, as well as in a variety of clubs and organizations. She holds a BA and MA from NYU and a certificate of completion from the University of Judaism. The mother of 6, grandmother of 8, great-grandmother of 6, and great-great-grandmother of 2, Jan recently celebrated her 100th birthday. Welcome, Jan Elbaum.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here this morning. I was born the year that women got the vote. And by the time I was old enough to use that vote, I had been pushed, pulled, prodded, pinched, demeaned, annoyed and ignored by professors who didn't want women in their classes, bullied by men students who didn't want women in their classes. And there was nothing we could do about it. This is something that happened to women. And I would say that at least 3/4 of my audience will agree that they went through the same thing. This was nothing new. Women had no protection. If a girl had been mistreated, if she had been raped, and she was brave enough to insist upon her justice, in most cases, she would be crucified in court. She never had the option of, but she did take the option sometimes of just dropping out altogether because it was too much and she was being bullied and terrorized too much to say anything more. By the time we get into the late 20th century and early 21st century, we are beginning to see a few women's organizations that are going to be taking this problem and trying to make it better, trying to help. In 2006, the organization called Me Too was started by a woman named Tamara Banks, who started it because young Black women and young women of color were not having any protection of any kind. So she started it to teach them how to take care of themselves. And this was one of the first organizations to help women in that way. Now, Jodie Cantor is a very interesting young woman. She is now approximately 45 years old. She's a Columbia grad, graduated magna cum laude. She had a fellowship to Israel in 1996 and 7. And when she came back, she took a year of law school, decided it wasn't for her. And she wrote to the New York Times, telling them that their art section was inadequate for a newspaper of that quality. And she explained how the art department should handle that section of the paper. Well, she was offered a job at the Times at that time. And by the time she was 28 years old, she was the youngest editor of a section that had ever been for the New York Times. At the age of 28, she was the head of the department, of the art department. By the time we get to 2007, the art section wasn't enough for her. She wanted to go into investigative reporting. So she started investigating different topics that the Times felt were important. She did a section on breastfeeding in the workplace and discovered, not surprisingly, that wealthy women, or women who had better jobs, were given facilities for pumping breast milk or feeding babies if they had a childcare section, whereas poor women had no opportunity at all. They weren't given the time to do this or the space to do it. So she wrote a whole thing about breastfeeding in the workplace. She found out that the United States had promised aid to a whole group of Syrians and then had reneged on it. Canada took them, and she did a section on how Canada was treating these refugees and how they had been of such value to the Canadian economy. Another thing that she did was a section on Amazon. Some of her information was not too accurate, but many of the things that she put into her article brought very important changes to the workplace at Amazon as well. She was told that there were rumors going around about one of the producers, a big producer in Hollywood, Harvey Weinstein. Well, he was only a producer. He wasn't that important. Why was this going to be such an interesting thing? Then it seemed that the rumors were not just very big, but had gone on for years and years and years. And the Times decided it was time that there was some kind of an investigation. So she began looking into it. And what she found was so big that the Times editors decided she needed a second voice to be with her. So Megan Twohey at that time had been working on another project, but she was so good that they asked her if she would be willing to go into this with Jodie. Well, at the time she was on maternity leave. She was 2 months away from having her first child. And she agreed that she would do some of the work, although she wouldn't get too involved in the running around section of it. Now, Megan Twohey was an interesting young woman as well. She had, both of her parents were in news media, very prominent people. She had graduated from the University of Georgia and decided that her field was going to be looking into sexual assaults. And she began doing something for the Times about sexual assault, which fed in very nicely to what Megan was now doing. Okay, now the book is called She Said, which of course we understand because for years this has been the watchword. A woman says, he attacked me. He says he didn't. She says he did. So she said, he said becomes kind of a catchword, and the book is called She Said. It starts with rumors, a lot of rumors. Now, you have to understand, in Hollywood, there have been open secrets for 100 years, all the way back into the silent era. Women were abused. Women were taken advantage of. They were promised parts in exchange for sexual favors. Some of them did, some of them didn't. Jack Warner, who was a very important producer in the 30s and 40s and 50s, was known to be a pedophile. Was known. And his brothers, who knew what was going on, enabled him by not going to the authorities, just allowing this to go on. So that when we get up into the late 1980s and 1990s, and the rumors begin about Harvey Weinstein, who was then a young man who and his brother Bob had started this company called Miramax, an independent company, which burgeoned because they had very sharp, very on the line, new kinds of movies. And she began to trace some of these rumors. Now, it was kind of a network. Nobody was talking. It was there. Well, you have to go talk to, who was the first one? Rose McGowan. Rose McGowan was a young actress. And she had come out 6 months before and said she had been abused by a producer and the Times had ignored her. Then what happened with Rose McGowan is that she spoke at a political dinner and she was furious at the Times because the Times had quoted the men who had spoken in the political section, and they had taken her speech and put it in the style section for the women. And she was furious because she said that was against the rules, and it was strictly against her because she was a woman. And she thought that she was not going to help the Times do anything. But Jodie was very persuasive. And she started to talk, and she said, you have to go talk to Ashley Judd. Now, I'm not much for movies, so some of these names don't mean anything to me, but I understand that Ashley Judd was a very, very up-and-coming ingenue, and she had been in several pictures, and she had been at these film festivals where the pictures she had made were up for awards of all kinds. All I know is the picture I saw of her is that she was a beautiful young woman. Ashley Judd was the first person other than Rose to whom Jodie spoke. But she hinted about things and didn't come out very clearly about anything because she was not in a position to talk. Why didn't Jodie go talk to Gwyneth Paltrow? Well, Gwyneth Paltrow's name I had heard, so I knew that she was also an up-and-coming young, beautiful ingenue. And again, the same thing happened. She was willing to sit down and talk, but she wouldn't put her finger onto anything. But she had heard that there was a woman many years, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, who had been an assistant to Harvey Weinstein, and suddenly she had disappeared. And over the years, nobody knew what had happened to her, didn't even bother looking because she was only an assistant in the office. She was an assistant to Harvey, but she wasn't important. Jodie began hearing rumors that there was an American woman who was living quietly in Wales. So Jodie went to London because she had heard that this woman was going to be in London and maybe she could find out who she was. Well, she got a name, and she went to Wales. And she went to this house, knocked on the door, beautiful woman in her 40s, 50s, opened the door, and wouldn't let Jodie in, but went outside and sat down outside and began talking to Jodie. Wouldn't say anything explicit, but hinted. And then she said, why don't you talk to so-and-so? And this is what was happening. One person would say, well, yes, I know what you're talking about, but I can't really say anything. Why don't you talk to so-and-so? And it kind of was a trail, and it led from one person to the other. And then the initials NDA began coming up. Now, what's an NDA? Turns out it's something called a non-disclosure agreement. And the non-disclosure agreement was something that you didn't go against. So by now, Megan has had her child, and now Megan starts to work and begins to start investigating. And young women, they begin to get this picture. Harvey Weinstein would go to all the film festivals. Now, he was a very busy man, no question about it. He always had a lot of irons in the fire. If it wasn't this picture, it was a film festival of some kind. When it wasn't a film festival, he was having conferences about this kind of script or that kind of script. So he always had an assistant, at least one. He would get the assistants. They would send the assistants to Harvey, and the assistant would get to the hotel, assume she was meeting them in the lobby or in a downstairs room, and they would send her up to his room, where invariably he was in a bathrobe. And he would try to convince her to give him a massage. And he would take the bathrobe off, and he would be nude. And these poor young women, who were usually, young, early 20s, beginning in business and what have you. And he would take off his robe, he would be nude, and he would try to talk them into giving him a massage or letting him give them a massage. And several times he was able to get them down on a bed and start playing around, and they would get out and run, and then they would be getting a different job, or you wouldn't hear from them again. And there would be a rumor about $100,000 or $40,000, and there was always a lawyer, some kind of a lawyer. And apparently what was happening, and it was very common, a young woman who would go through this, and she would run away, and somebody would say, get a lawyer. And the lawyer would convince her that she should take a monetary answer. And why not? He was getting 30 or 40% of it. So we were beginning to get a lot of this business with NDAs. The stories that were coming out dealt with a lot of women who were both in the film business and in the business end of it. And the same thing was happening with both. A woman named Laura Madden was one of the very few who would start to talk. And she was describing a certain incident that happened in Italy, in Venice. She and her assistant, a girl named Rowena Chu, had been in Venice at the film festival. And Rowena was young. She was only 23. She had been hired as Laura's assistant. And she went to Harvey's room. Actually, he got her down as far as her underwear, and he had her on a bed, and she pushed at him and finally got him off, grabbed her clothes and ran to Megan, to Laura, and cried in her arms and told her what had happened. And the next day, Laura went to a restaurant where Harvey was sitting, said to him in front of his friends, I want to talk to you, and got him out and told him that she was taking Rowena and they were going to London and they were going to file suit against him. Well, he pretended, wasn't really this important, but they did. They went to London and they got a lawyer through somebody that Laura knew, and they wanted to file suit against him. And they were told that because they hadn't filed in Venice, they couldn't do it in London because the actual assault had not happened there. And there was a lot of back and forth, and yes, he did, no, he didn't, they're wrong, this was nothing. And it ended up finally with each of the girls getting 135,000 pounds and signing the non-disclosure agreement. By now, Megan and Jodie had found dozens and dozens of women who said yes, they had been, but no, they wouldn't talk. The non-disclosure agreements were written in such a way that they bound the young women so tightly that, and with such really terrific legal language, they couldn't get out of it. You couldn't tell your parents, you couldn't tell your siblings, you couldn't tell anyone in your family, you couldn't talk about it with your friends. If you went to a therapist, one of their lawyers had to be in the sessions with you to dispute anything that you claimed. A whole list of things that the lawyers felt would tie these women into really a knot that they couldn't get out of. And in many cases, these young women were bullied into signing the agreements. They would have 3 or 4 or 5, or in some cases 6 lawyers hammering at these poor girls, telling them that they weren't going to be able to get away with this, that there were proof that the girls had been tramps and that they had asked for the trouble, and that no, nothing had really happened. They were wrong. So they would be going from yes, you did to no, you didn't, and got these poor girls in such a mess that half of them just signed just to get away from the lawyers. And they came out with amounts anywhere from $50,000 to $200,000, signing the agreements because this is the only way they could get out of it. So Megan and Jodie began writing their article. And of course, as soon as they began writing their article, the lawyers began attacking. The girls were followed, they were harassed. They had phone calls threatening them. You can't write that because if you do, you're going to be sued. Name calling and everything you can imagine. All the while they were putting the information together and writing what became a 3,300 word article that ultimately won the Pulitzer Prize. But what was happening all the while they were putting the material together with all of the names that they had, even that they didn't have any of the girls actually saying he did so and so because they couldn't. The agreements were so tight they couldn't do it. But they had enough circumstantial evidence and enough background material and enough material that they were able to get about monies that were going out, that the women were able to write the article. And we find out as we go along the way the women are writing this. And I must say that the agreement that two women had made when they started to write the book was that it wasn't going to be a matter of Jodie did this or Megan did this. It was we did this, whether it was one person or both, but they never used a name because they wanted to make it just as one voice. The lawyers began demanding to see what the girls were writing as they were writing. They didn't even want to wait until the article was finished. They began demanding that the Times let them see what has been written. They wanted a chance to refute any of this thing. The girls to whom they talked were not reliable. And the whole rigmarole kept going on and on. 1 minute Harvey Weinstein would be screaming that they were attacking him unjustly and that he had been nice to them and he hadn't done a single thing. And the next minute he was saying, well, after all, boys will be boys. Why shouldn't blah, blah, blah. So he was so unstable, and he would carry on and rant and rave, and then he would be quiet and sweet and serene. It was as though he were two different people. His brother, Bob, knew what was going on. Never, as he said, he never thought it was any more than just a little bit of philandering, even though Harvey was married, and it was just nothing serious. But again, like Jack Warner's brother, he kept paying and enabling the brother because he didn't say to him, stop, or let's see what's going on. You can't do this anymore. So the writing is going on, and the Times finally announces that the article is going to be printed. And because legally, when you write an article about someone, you have to give them the chance to see it before you publish, they sent the article to Harvey Weinstein and his lawyers, and they had a big meeting scheduled at the office of the Times with the two writers and their attorneys and the editors, and Harvey Weinstein comes in with 5 attorneys. Now, one of his attorneys is Lisa Bloom. Lisa Bloom is the daughter of, oh my goodness, of Gloria Allred. And, you know, I've always thought that Gloria was a great voice, and she's just wonderful. And then I find out from this paper and from this book that Gloria has been on teams of lawyers who have browbeaten women into signing NDAs and collecting fees. So here's my idol of feminism, who has been betraying women for years by working against them to get agreements like this. Lisa is a pistol. She is violent. She is nasty. She attacks the two women as though they are insignificant children. She yells at them. She calls them liars. They are destructive. And the lawyers want this changed and that changed. And the women refuse to change anything because this is the way it is. And that's how it actually happened. So the article is finally published on October 5th, and something amazing happens. Within a day, people all over the world, women all over the world, are writing. They are sending emails. They are getting onto Twitter, talking about the things that had happened to them. And they are coming out openly and accusing people, accusing the men who have violated them over the years. And it's as though a floodgate opens, and there are thousands of articles. The telephones actually collapse, and they have to stop taking email because it's coming in at such a clip. It's actually a landslide. And unfortunately, what happens, that always happens, along with this, you get a panic, and you get women who accuse who really have no right accusing. So you get the bad along with the good. But the article comes out, it is highly successful, and now they are in a place where they decide they're going to write the book. And they take a year out and they write the book. And the writing of the book is interesting. The first part of the book itself, they have a very interesting foreword, which explains how they got together and why this was so important to them and what it means to women all over. And then they start to give you names and dates. And the whole first little section gives you the name of certain women, the dates that happened, and you go back and forth. And it's a little confusing with all the names and dates because they're going from 1995 to 2017 and then back again. But when they start to write about what was happening and their interaction with the women who have been molested by him and the emotions that they have found as they write this become very personal. You have to feel along with them how important this has been to them. And they have written about these women with such empathy that you feel for them as you go along. The writing is good because it flows. So many times when you're doing this kind of a expose, you get a clipped sort of a feel. But there's a nice flow to this. You can feel how important it is to the women that they have taken this particular problem that is universal. Now, we know women in certain parts of the world are treated shamefully, and in comparison, these things are minor. But when you start to realize that women have been fighting this kind of thing for generations, it's not just since we've been alive, it's something but that women accepted as right. As right. This is how women behave. This is what they were for. A woman would never go beyond a certain point of independence. We are so used to our independence that when we read something about these poor girls who were stuck into positions because they either needed the job or because they wanted to go forward in their careers. So you feel a bond, not just with the women who are writing about it, but about these women about whom they are writing. To the men who are listening to this, this is not a diatribe against men. This is about some men. And I think that every man knows which of their friends is a minor predator. You know, a little pinch here, a tap there, it's not that important. We, as young people, we heard the old business boys will be boys, and you have to expect them to behave differently. But the book itself gives you this strong feeling that maybe something will be done. Who knows? All right, going along in the book, you know, the book is not just about one thing. So it isn't just about Harvey Weinstein. A couple of months after the business with Harvey Weinstein is over, he's convicted in February. He's given, I think, 27 or 28 years in prison because of rape. But Jodie gets a phone call from an attorney named Deborah Katz. Deborah has a woman who has come to her with a problem. And she thinks that this is something that the New York Times should look into as well. Deborah has a client whose name is Christine, what's her name? I'm trying to remember now. Christine, I can't remember her middle name, Ford, Paisley Ford. And she has a problem. An old acquaintance of hers who attacked her is now up for a position as a Supreme Court judge. And she feels that this man should not be a judge of the Supreme Court. So she goes to she talks to herself about it. She wonders, and she goes to her local political leader, not the assembly person, and says to the assembly person, I have a problem. This man is going to be nominated to the Supreme Court, And if he did this to me, he may have done it to others. And I don't think this is the kind of a man who should be in the Supreme Court judging things like abortion rights. If he feels this way about women, I don't know whether he's right. And I think maybe somebody should say something. And that's it. She goes home and says nothing else. And then she doesn't hear anything more. So she goes to the next step up and she writes a letter to her congressperson, who also seems to ignore it. And the news now is saying, yes, that he is going to be nominated. And Christine is very upset about this because nothing is being done. So she writes a letter to Dianne Feinstein, and she says, this is in complete confidence. And she tells her story to Dianne Feinstein, completely off the record, makes it very clear. She doesn't want to do anything more than just have a couple of questions given to this man. And we know it burgeons. It gets out of hand completely. And her name is brought up, and now the big political thing starts. And they are going to insist that she come to Washington to testify. She doesn't want to. She doesn't want to have anything more to do with it. She felt that all she wanted to do was report that maybe he should be questioned about his sexual mores when he was younger, and let it at least come out, see if anybody else has a complaint. So this poor woman who really doesn't want to do anything more than what she feels is her civic duty is put into this terrible position. And we know what happened to her. She went to finally decided, and the sad thing about it is that she is deathly afraid to fly. She will never go on a big vacation because she's afraid of flying. Once every 4 or 5 years, she will go back home to Washington, D.C. to visit her family. But they literally have to knock her out to get her on the plane because she's so deathly afraid of flying. So here she is now being forced into going back to Washington, or they will subpoena her if she doesn't go on her own. So she goes on her own, and this is what has happened. Okay, the event unfortunately had colored her whole life. She'd been in and out of therapy. It had given her fears of being with people. She couldn't go into a room with only one door, because if she went into a room with one door, she would insist upon the door being open. When she built her own house, she built 2 doors into most places because she needed an escape hatch. This is how badly it had affected her. However, we know what had happened, and we know that at the time she didn't. One of the reasons she gave about not testifying is because her father still played golf with Brett Kavanaugh's father, and she didn't want to upset her family. But she writes very sympathetically. They write sympathetically about this case, and they refer back to the Anita Hill thing, and it had been 27 years. And the question is, have we changed in any way? It's a question that she asks in the book. Now, we have to look and see if her book or any of the things that have happened lately have made a difference. We have been talking about sexual assault on women for generations. We know this is something that's been done. Has there been a change of any kind? Well, let me give you a little example. 1943, I was working for the Navy as a civilian. We had an officer in our office. Now, this was an office with 104 women, 3 floors of the nice building in Los Angeles. And it was a very important, quite secret area. We had this young officer. We had half of our women were civilians and half of them were Navy waives. And this young guy assumed that every female in the place was fair game. There wasn't a decent looking woman in the place that he hadn't sidled up to, touched, pushed a little bit, shoved up against a wall, pinched, and the complaints were coming in hot and heavy. And we finally were able to get him transferred out. He was transferred to Washington with a promotion, which was kind of par for the course. That was 1943. In 2018, the incidence of rape and assault in the military against women was at a tremendous number. 22% of the women in the military were complaining about being not assaulted necessarily, but certainly imposed upon in one way or another. And it was something that you couldn't do anything about, because a lot of the women said you couldn't go up the channels because the next guy up in the chain was one of the guys who bothered them. And not only that, but in the same year, we have a United States Air Force general in Colorado saying the women have no right to complain about sexual assault. If they think that they're going to be soldiers, they have to behave like them and learn how to take care of themselves. So we have all of these years and all of these things happening. And the question is, does a book like this make any change? Does it just bring up a question and say, here's the question, what do we do? Thank you. Questions, anybody?
Well, thank you. That was wonderful. That was really fascinating. Right. I'm not sure how our questions might go. I would suggest that our audience feel free to ask Jan any question that comes to mind at this point. And I think actually I'm going to start with Pat, because she's our current president, and I'm going to ask her, Pat, could you unmute yourself and please anything you'd like to ask Jan at this point?
Yes, thank you very much. That was wonderful. Getting back to the book, Weinstein was, he denied all the charges and he had millions spent on lawyers and there were no witnesses. So how did the two journalists prove that their informants were telling the truth? Is it just the volume that did it? Because I believe them, but you think it was the volume that did it?
It was not just the volume, it was the similarity of statements and the fact that there were the NDAs, and you know, where there's smoke, there's fire, supposedly. But the very fact that women who had been in contact with him, and not with each other, but with the same kind of a story. So the weight of comment, shall I say, was such that the fact checkers, and there were many, the Times, New York Times has a whole department of fact checkers. They were able to verify places and times, and the sheer number of people who said the same thing, right, is what the weight was more than anything else.
Thank you.
Okay, so Barbara Siri, our former president, would you like to ask something?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you. This was really helped clarify some confusions I had, particularly about NDAs. But let me stop, because this is just such a tragic story, because these young women who were by Harvey Weinstein invited into the Miramax family. He'd always call it a family. And I'm going to take care of you, your career. Imagine how much encouragement he gave, and then to have it come crashing down in those hotel rooms with him coming out in his bathrobe. I just, you know, to me, that was just such a graphic, shocking incident that these poor women had to deal with. But my question is, these NDAs, I was always under the impression that when you signed a contract with with Miramax before anything happened that you had to sign an NDA, and apparently that's not the case. So these women had already taken a settlement and then were forced to sign the NDA. Is that the way it
No,
went, Jan?
it's a combination. The money doesn't come until the signature is there. Now, a lot of these big businesses, including Miramax, have confidentiality agreements. Now, that's not the same as an NDA. The confidentiality says that anything that happens in the workplace, they don't talk about. But the NDAs actually tie them up into knots. There are stipulations, as many as 30 and 40 stipulations, dealing with every aspect of their private lives. Now, you cannot expect a young woman who is emotionally battered not to want to talk to her mother or her sister or her girlfriend, or certainly to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. But these NDAs tied them up so tightly, and they were so extensive. And the problem was a lot of the girls said they have no option. They were battered, not physically, but emotionally by 4 and 5 men, primarily men, attorneys who literally put a pen in their hands. And
can I just follow up on that for a second? Were there any women who refused to take a settlement?
Yes.
And then not sign the NDA? And what happened to them? Where was their story?
Lost their jobs.
Pardon me?
They lost their jobs, and they had
didn't have no other recourse. They wouldn't have any recourse to a reporter, nothing like that, or their own attorney.
No. For example, Rose McGowan. Rose McGowan refused to accept anything. She wouldn't accept anything.
Okay, I see.
But what happened is that in her bank account, $100,000 appeared, and she immediately turned around and donated it to the closest rape center.
Really? You mean Weinstein's attorneys forced money into her bank account without her knowing it?
They deposited $100,000 in her bank account, and she
to compromise her. It was to compromise her.
Right. She turned around and donated to the rape center. Yeah.
That I did not know. That's amazing.
Yeah, she's quite a gal. Yeah.
Well, this was certainly enlightening and horrifying and depressing.
Can you imagine these girls that, you say to yourself, well, at 22 or 23, I had a responsible job. No one could have done that to me. But we're talking about a lot of young women who are not sophisticated, who have not had, maybe not had gone to college, but who had come from small towns and gone to Hollywood to either to get into the production end or to be actresses and stars in their eyes. And then something like this happens to them, and the act itself is so emotional that they are wide open for any kind of pressure. And first of all, they're traumatized by what has happened. And then these lawyers, these big shot lawyers who say, and they have their own lawyers. And I have to think to myself, some of these lawyers are pretty bad. They say to the girls, yes, we're going to sue, but something, we're not going to be able to do it. So let's take the money. Why not? They get 40% of it.
Oh yeah, right.
So a lot of the girls, but these young women, some of them were pressured so badly that it colored their lives. It's sad. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that leads a bit to my question, which is really just an attempt to pick up on what you were saying about where are we now. But before I ask my question or we talk about it, I would like to make a comment. Now, I have not read this book, nor have I read Ronan Farrow's book, which is on the same topic, but I have seen and read a lot about them. And it was my impression that one of the things that was very useful to Megan and Jodie was that Weinstein's accountant gave them some information, some kind of a paper trail about the money, so that even though the women themselves were not really willing to go on the record and so forth, or and name dates and times, there was some evidence that unusual payments had been made. And assuming that is the case, and actually in Farrow's book, it's very interesting. He was really hot on the trail, but he had no evidence and they were threatening him. But it turned out that one of the people who was threatening him felt so guilty about it that he turned tail and he actually told Farrow what was going on. So in both of these cases, the reason, or one of the fundamental reasons that he was brought down, he was convicted, he wasn't just humiliated publicly, was because somebody was treasonous in a way. Now, and that leads to my comment, or our question, which I'd like to close on, which has to do with where are we going to go from here? Because what we see is that, as you were saying, that most of these women are successfully bullied. There's no way really around it. They're pressured into these disclosures. So if somebody says anything, they're putting themselves in legal jeopardy. If they refuse the agreement, then they can go public, but it's she said, he said.
Exactly.
So as we move forward now, and I'm afraid we've become so distracted with, now we have the pandemic and we have police brutality, which in a way is kind of a parallel, because we thought that when we first started filming police shooting Black people, that surely that would turn things around and people would be convicted and it would cease. And nothing of the kind has occurred. So, Jan, what can you expect? What do you tell your granddaughters and your great-granddaughters and your great-great-granddaughters as to how they should proceed with this issue?
I always talk to my sons and my grandsons, not the girls. I would talk to the boys and say, look, you have a sister, you have a mother. How do you want them to be treated? Do you want some guy to come along and pinch your sister or push her into a bad situation? No, you wouldn't. So how do you think somebody else's sister feels? How about one of your friends? How about his sister? And I think that we have to educate the boys. The girls were being told for years, keep your knees together, wear your clothes properly. Do you remember those? I can remember my teachers being very, very, girls, your knees together. And as a kid, of course, I didn't understand why you sit with your knees together. But you have to teach the boys. The girls, we automatically say, honey, be careful. Don't do this, don't do that. My grandmother used to say to me, well, she would talk to me in Yiddish or Hungarian, and when she would give me a little bit of money tied up, she would say to me, now put it in your bosom, don't lose it. And remember, don't go into any alleys.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I think this has really been an excellent program, a program that we've enjoyed a great deal. Concerned Citizens thanks Jan Elbaum for preparing such an informative review, and thanks you, our audience, for watching this broadcast. As long as the lockdown persists, Concerned Citizens Presents will be offering in-home programming. Please join us for another episode soon.